Welcome back to the International Energy Agency's podcast, Everything Energy. I'm Dan Hewitt. This week we're exploring geothermal energy, the future beneath our feet. The idea of harnessing the Earth's heat to generate electricity or provide heating is nothing new. In 1904, Italy's Piero Giannori Conti used steam from the Earth to power light bulbs, a breakthrough that paved the way for geothermal heating in homes and large-scale power plants. If you're picturing lava and hot springs, you're not alone, but technological breakthroughs might be about to change how we think about geothermal energy. The energy stored in the top 10 kilometres of the Earth has multiple times more potential than all the fossil fuel reserves combined. Yet today, geothermal meets just 1% of global electricity demand. It's abundant, it's clean, it's right beneath our feet. So why is geothermal energy often overlooked in the clean energy conversation? What role do oil and gas companies and governments have in making it more affordable? And just how excited should we be about its future? Here to discuss this from the IEA are two senior analysts and authors of the recent report on the future of geothermal energy, Haimi Bahar and Rebecca Schultz. Haimi and Rebecca, thanks for joining us. So starting with you, Haimi, set the scene for us. The technology for geothermal energy has been around for over 100 years, but which parts of the world benefited from it?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. So geothermal, as you said, has been around for a very long time, but it was accessible in only certain countries where the resources are easily achievable or easily extractable, let's put it this way. And it's in specific parts of the world. Iceland comes as one of the top geothermal players, but not only that, some parts of the United States, Japan, Turkey, Indonesia, Philippines, some parts in Latin America has resources. Those that we see that the heat is coming automatically under the ground, so it's easily accessible. So we have developed most of these resources over the last, let's say, 100 years for electricity, but also for heating.
And in basic terms, how does the technology work? So how do you turn heat from the ground into energy?
So, there are different ways of doing it, but you basically achieve certain temperatures of heat under the ground. It's either in the form of direct steam that you take out, or it's in the form of liquid that you take out, hot water basically, and then you use it to turn either an electric turbine, like a steam turbine, to put it in simple terms, or to basically use the water to heat, use it directly in homes or in district heating systems. You basically distribute the hot water through the system for heating purposes.
It's efficient, it's reliable, it's versatile, it can be used for industry and domestic heating. So a question for you, Rebecca, why is there a gap between its staggering potential and the amount of energy we actually use from it?
I think there's a few different underlying reasons behind that. Part of it is an awareness. So if you look across different countries, there's really only a handful of countries that have geothermal targets and geothermal roadmaps. It's just not as politically, widely aware as compared to solar, wind, hydrothermal, and others. But also where it has been really driving home outside of conventional hydrothermal power, when we start talking about next generation geothermal potential, really diving into heat systems. A lot of that has been happening more so in the U.S. And in some parts of Europe as well. And it hasn't really driven the cost as down as it needs to go in order to be as competitive with some of those other technologies.
So do you think there's a perception problem? Do you think there's a lack of understanding or even a PR problem about some of the ways that it could be used?
Well, I think when we talk about geothermal, I think one of the difficult things is there's so many different sub-technologies under geothermal. So when we talk about geothermal, we're talking about heat, we're talking about electricity generation, but then we're also talking about, lithium brine extraction and heat storage or an energy storage. And so when we say geothermal, it ends up being sort of this generic term that encompasses a huge number of technologies. And the amount of innovation that's happening under each one of those is really drastic, especially over the last 5 to 10 years, especially the last 5 years. And so I think it's helpful to have, a structure of how to think about these things, and then also to have more public awareness and understanding of what is happening and what is associated with each.
And you mentioned the technology there, because 40 or 50 years ago, utility companies did try to dig deeper, but the technology wasn't quite there. So, Amy, maybe you could tell us about some of the big game-changing technologies out there that are making people feel more confident.
Sure. So, as I mentioned, the traditional geothermal that these limited number of countries have, we know the technology. You drill couple of kilometers down, and you don't even need that in most of the places because it's closer to the ground. But what happened over the last 5 to 10 years, that revolution or technological breakthroughs that happened in the oil and gas industry, mostly in the United States, so-called fracking, and going deeper under the ground and developing techniques, not only developing techniques actually, but also making them cheaper and cheaper, has basically created a kind of a wake-up call for the geothermal industry, because there are a lot of similarities between the two. And then geothermal industry started to ask themselves, okay, can we use some of these to extract heat, not oil or gas from the ground? So I think that was a big trigger, and then I think Rebecca maybe can mention a bit more on this as well. There's a big startup community that has emerged after this, mostly ex-oil and gas industry people who basically started companies that can actually change a little bit the way we approach geothermal. So can we go deeper? Can we drill not only vertically but horizontally? Can we inject water or other fluids under the ground to extract heat? How can we achieve the stability and so on and so forth? I think then oil and gas companies started to see this development and started slowly investing into these startups and many others. Also, the policymakers were aware of this. I think the program in Department of Energy that is giving grants or loans for these kind of new companies has been tremendously important to achieve the first projects. And in that sense, I think now we are at a point where this technology and I would say young people starting startups and trying to explore the opportunities has been the major game changer. And I think this way of approaching has worked in the energy business for the innovation. I think we are on a positive path for the cost reductions as well.
And I'm not sure who would like to pick up on this, but these aren't hypothetical ideas, are they? I mean, you mentioned hydrofracturing or fracking, but that's being used right now to extract geothermal energy.
So maybe I can jump in there because I want to build on a few different points that Jaime had pointed to. And the first really comes down to geothermal, these next generation geothermal technologies. They essentially stem out of research out of Los Alamos National Laboratory out of the 1970s, so out of hot, dry rock. And so it's not that it's necessarily a new technology, but what's drastically different today, as before they were drilling vertical wells, a vertical well to inject and a vertical well to produce, it just wasn't really getting enough time and enough contact time in the reservoir. And the shale revolution really changed that. And so you saw with these energy entrepreneurs, and I might be biased, but they're sort of my heroes, are energy entrepreneurs of today. Those are the people like George Mitchell that in the 1980s up until the early 2000s was really driving some of that unconventional shale revolution. So how do you go from drilling not just vertical wells, but drilling horizontal wells? And then how do you change that fracking technology that's, started in the 1800s, but really started to kick off in the 1949? These are decades old technologies, but they're being tweaked and being updated and being made more efficient and cheaper over time that have really broke open the unconventional shale gas and shale oil revolution. So taking these technologies that are already out there in the oil and gas industry and then deploying them today, and I think there's, the Utah Forge example is a great one that is a public-private partnership really between the US DOE, the University of Utah, but also across national labs, universities, industry, that really broke open and made these concepts of how to not just take the unconventional technologies, how to apply them in this hot, dry rock and these really deep hot granitic basins, but also drive down the cost, drive down the time, and really show that actually this is something that truly is achievable. And then you have a whole swath of different startups that are tackling almost every aspect of geothermal that you can think of. And it's not, it's not just the young people. What I really see are also the people that have been working this industry for decades that still feel that they've got a huge amount to contribute, that are doing these startups, that are taking their knowledge, their skills, their innovation, and applying this to geothermal. And so you see a number of different companies that are out there, Sage, and but also newer ones like Fervo as well, that are taking and applying this technology and really starting to open up some new cases and some new opportunities for geothermal.
You've mentioned a few technologies there, but should we be excited by ground source heat pumps or any other technology, or is most of the excitement from technologies that are drilling down 4,000 or 5,000 feet into the earth?
I mean, I think all of them have a use. I mean, heat pump technology has also been there for a very long time, but the business case was not there. Now there are new business case innovations that are being implemented at not only household level, but a certain neighborhood level, which basically is driving down the cost. There are a few companies in the United States that do that. I mean, practically, ground source heat pumps and the availability of that heat, low temperature heat, is everywhere. I mean, there is no geographical limit to that. And also for the deeper technologies, what you achieve for me the most is that when you go deeper, you don't rely on certain nature resources that are existing in few countries that I basically cited in the beginning of the podcast. So that basically you unlock an opportunity where you're not geographically limited anymore. You can do it anywhere because once you go deep enough, the heat is there. You just need to extract it. So I think for the policymakers to increase their awareness around this is to make them understand that this can be everywhere. So because when they think about geothermal, they think about, okay, it's Indonesia has it, Philippines has it, Turkey has it, US some parts, but that's it. But actually, it's not true anymore with these technologies that can go deeper. And I think that's the big change of geographical limitations are not there anymore.
So to make the most of geothermal energy, how much are we going to need to utilize the skills of drilling companies, of oil and gas companies, people who are used to drilling deep down into the rock, because they have decades of expertise that feels like a very rich source if we're going to make the most of this energy?
Yeah, so it's a direct handover. So we view anything we have in the report along the lines of about 80% of geothermal technologies have a high degree of crossover with the oil and gas industry. So it's a really natural bridge between the two. So innovations in one almost always can work backwards to the other and vice versa. So we do need the drilling companies. We do need the completion companies that are out there. But even more so beyond that, because there is an element of drilling or completing or fracking these wells, depending on the type of technology that we're talking about, there's also an element that we need to make sure these projects are continuing to produce. So what is the production chemistry that's behind it? How do we sustainably produce these for the long term?
Now, I want to talk a little bit about price point, because if it's more profitable drilling down into the earth for fossil fuels, what conversation can you have with these companies to say, well, there is less money in geothermal, but these are the reasons that we should look into extracting it from the ground?
So that's the million-dollar question, cost point. So I think one of the reasons why oil and gas majors were not directly involved in geothermal is because the returns are not there yet. And the same thing holds true for them for solar and wind. Still today, very few oil and gas companies are directly investing in solar and wind projects because the returns that they get from extracting and selling oil is much more profitable. And then they have an obligation to return profits to their shareholders. And today, geothermal, especially these new technologies, are expensive. We have two, I'll say, commercial projects that are giving us a lot of hope, and not only us but all the geothermal industry, with a lot of help from grants and investment, seed investment from many companies. So that's the way it should be, because these are the first projects. They will be expensive, but already these first projects have shown over a very short period of time how they can reduce the costs of drilling. So that's quite impressive already today, in my opinion. And if this trend continues, and we did it in the report showing how solar PV costs were declined over the last decade versus what could be geothermal trajectory if this kind of investments and innovation continues. And if it follows the same kind of a pathway, we could see geothermal projects, like cost of geothermal going down to $50 per megawatt hour, the next generation geothermal project. Then it becomes an interesting part of the future.
And where is it now? Where is the price point today?
The price point today is around 250 to 300. So we are talking about significant cost reduction. So it's very difficult to calculate the exact price point as well, because these projects received a lot of different funding. So, but in our initial starting point, I think we put around 275, somewhere there, and then show how it can go down to $50 per megawatt hour. That's the hope. That's the many startups' goal. They cite this number 50 to 70, 40 to 60. I think this price point that everybody knows, that then geothermal becomes, for electricity generation, a very interesting option that can complement wind and solar PV, because it's dispatchable, which means you can run it 90 to 80% of the time in any hour of the day where the wind is not blowing or sun is not shining. So you can actually complement wind and solar PV projects. So in that sense, I think this price point can unlock a lot of the market opportunities everywhere in the world, which will be needed. Already we see in a lot of the markets that wind and solar is expanding very fast, that they need to invest in some kind of a dispatchable technologies that can be run flexibly, and geothermal can be one of the key options to do that.
And Rebecca, earlier you mentioned entrepreneurs who are coming up with new ideas for this. But what help do they need from governments? What does help look like? What sort of help do they need, and at what point in the process?
It's a great question, and it's always hard to speak on behalf of a number of different talented individuals. What we've heard is that people would like to see more geothermal targets and roadmaps out there, so that there is a broader awareness of what the opportunity space really is. There's also a large degree and an element around standardization of resource assessments. So how does a company know, especially if it's looking to invest, if it invests in one location in the US or another location in Europe, what is the characterization, for example, of the geothermal resource that is under our feet, and how do they know that if they're investing in one location or another, how one is better or worse potentially than the other? But primarily, there's also a lot of red tape and difficulties with respect to permitting. When you're talking about geothermal resources and minerals and heat, you may end up dealing with a huge number of government ministries and bodies that each touch upon, whether it's the water, the hydrocarbons, the minerals, the heat itself. In many locations, heat is actually not yet decided in terms of who actually owns it or how it's legislated or how it can be produced. And you can't begin some of these opportunities and begin some of these businesses unless you have a path forward in terms of how you can actually permit it under a certain regulatory scheme.
Because what people don't realize is that if you're drilling down through the rock, whatever mineral you go through, you need a permit for that specific rock, don't you? So maybe just explain how complicated the process is right now.
Part of it is there's not just one process, right? So every country that you go to, sometimes every city that you go to, has a different process in terms of how to actually access heat or the geothermal water resource that's underneath their feet. I think most recently in the US, Texas had made a number of different strides forward to really clarify who owns the heat, along with some of the subsurface water rights as well. And that has, I think, enabled a number of different companies to be able to actually step forward and to start moving into that space. But if you end up in a gray zone, you're not likely, a gray zone where you don't know who owns what, you're not likely to be a company that will be funded or financed if the person financing you can't actually see who's going to be owning the resource that's coming out of this. And so companies really do suffer from an ability to be able to capture financing unless they're able to see through that it's not just permitting red tape, but it's the regulation on ownership and heat and royalties.
And maybe add on to that. So as you mentioned, you need to go through all these permits just to extract heat, which is a commodity that is probably the simplest to extract. You have to go through all these minerals and stuff, different ministries, different permitting regimes, some federal, some state, some municipal. I mean, it's very complicated. And one thing that governments can do is to create a regulatory system for just to extract heat so that companies do not have to go through every single layer of the ground and get permits for every single part of the ground which they won't actually do anything about. And maybe other important thing about the government is that supporting innovation is quite important. So, I mean, awareness is very important, but also put some money on the table because we are not talking about a technology that is already mature. It's a mature in itself, extracting heat and running in an electrical turbine or steam turbine, but we are talking about some drilling processes which are quite deep and challenging. So in order to be able to achieve those, we need some kind of an innovation fund, some grants, some de-risking.
So this is grants and subsidies we're talking about,
exactly.
Or that's just part of the picture?
It's part of grants and subsidies are part of it, or you basically promise to buy electricity for certain years at a premium price. Basically, you need both supply and demand, I will say. So, which means that you need some funds that will reduce the investment cost of these technologies. And you will need at some point somebody to buy these technologies and give a certainty to the companies who are selling it for a certain period of time. I mean, these policies have been there for a very long time. We have used them for solar and wind. They showed some certain level of success. And I think when we look at geothermal, especially next generation geothermal, we should think about these kind of tools, especially in the beginning, in order to reduce the cost, basically. That's the main idea.
And can you give me a sense of the time scale? So if a country decides to start building today, traditionally or typically, how long are we looking at from either of you until people start seeing energy coming out of the ground?
Well, it takes a lot of time today to get the permits if there are no supports or government dedication to it. So it will take a lot of time. That's why one of the main suggestions of the report is that you need to reduce the permitting timelines for these projects to be on the ground. But I will say in a place, maybe Rebecca knows this better in the US context, but in Europe, there's this project by Ever in Germany. It's a special project supported by the European funds, German funds. It's a lot of things, innovation funds that is going on. It's a small project, but it's already drilled 5,000 meters down and 3,000 meters horizontally. So it's quite advanced, and I think for them it took around a few years to get the permitting, and immediately after to start the project, at least in Germany context. But it depends on the country, and it can take for years. I know some projects in Japan takes a decade to do.
And is the technology here at the moment, if we want to run out geothermal to potentially up to 10% of the energy mix, it's, as we've discussed, it's about 1% at the moment, do we have the technologies we need to do that? Do we have enough, for example, transformers? Or are we still waiting for some technological innovation? Or is that, in fact, a slightly difficult question to answer?
Well, I think you end up with geothermal taking essentially the complexities of the oil and gas industry, and then also the complexities when we're talking about power generation, electricity, the complexities with grids and everything on the power side as well. Then you're combining the two of those into a common supply chain, if you will. And so if I consider oil and gas projects, I would typically consider outside of unconventionals. I would typically consider something like a 4 to a 6 year cycle in order to make sure that they've got the right permitting, that supply chains are feeding in by the time you actually would get to, say, first oil or first gas. With unconventionals, if permitting is streamlined, it can be just a matter of months between the time you go and do your appropriate subsurface work to ensure that you've lowered the risk to the minimal possible. It can be just a few months before you actually go out and drill those oil and gas wells. But in this case, then you've also got to stand behind what is sometimes an incredibly long queue in order to actually connect up to the power grid. And I'd have to say, out of everything right now, you've got permitting times and then you've got the queue connection times that are really preventing a lot of, let's say, a lot of the faster turnaround time of some of these projects.
Now, can either of you give me a case for optimism that geothermal could be an attractive option in somewhere like Africa, where the price point may be high at the moment and perhaps there isn't as much infrastructure there, but are there reasons to feel that could be rolled out as quickly, if not faster, than other countries?
So we actually did this technical potential analysis in cooperation with Project Inner Space in the United States. They've been very helpful and did an incredible work to streamline this technical potential thing. And in that, Africa has the largest potential, actually, technical potential. So the resource that they have under the ground at many levels is incredible. That's we found out. And if you combine this with growing energy demand, need to meet this growing energy demand cost effectively, and deliver the power that people need for their economic development, if you match these both, they will need everything. Okay, so they will need wind, solar, whatever technology that you can build there will be useful. And geothermal can play an incredible role there because it also provides cooling, not only heating, so which will be needed there as well. So you can have this variety of the services that geothermal can provide with a lot of resources that are available. Already today, by the way, you don't need to go deeper in certain parts of Africa, such as in Kenya, for instance. So it will be a great opportunity for Africa if you can achieve those price points, with a big if. Because building anything in Africa today is quite difficult, even most mature technologies. So you need a lot of de-risking mechanisms because of the nature of the risks that are involved there. But geothermal will be a good combination, because if you try to build wind and solar in Africa, the grid is already weak. If you are adding to this weak grid technology which is variable over every hour of the day, doesn't work very well. It works, but it will have issues and challenges. So you need to grow the electricity system in a way that combines both these flexible and dispatchable technologies with wind and solar PV, and geothermal could play a very good role there.
And there are other reasons to be optimistic about areas in Southeast Asia?
Absolutely. I think Southeast Asia is in particular one of the areas, as you draw a line around from Japan on down through Indonesia. There's a huge amount of potential through that area. And so I think whether it's Southeast Asia, whether it's Africa, whether also it's Latin America, the Caribbean islands, the potential and the availability of geothermal really is quite widespread.
Now, give us a sense of how much of the energy mix geothermal could provide by 2050 if everything goes well.
So in the site scenario analysis that we conducted, so we basically found out that if the costs go down to the levels of $50 to $60 per megawatt hour for electricity, we will see that geothermal can meet 15% of the growth of the electricity to 2050, around 10% of global electricity generation, which is a massive number from 0.4 that we have today. A big change, considering that electricity demand in the world will grow. And for heating purposes, it's about also 8% of the heating needs that can meet, which is also a big number compared to less than 1% today. Again, depending on how the cost structure evolves. I repeat this because we are today at a very high cost, and there's a competition in the electricity market or heat market. There are many technologies that are competing, and geothermal, unfortunately, needs to do this cost reduction very rapidly to be able to play a role in the energy system, both for heat and electricity. So in that sense, I think there's kind of a race from today to 2035, whether we can achieve these cost structures. And if so, there is, I think, a great future for geothermal because it provides multiple services at the same time, which the world will need.
And what do you say to people who would suggest that the optimism about the price point coming down is frankly over-optimistic, and that the realities are that it's going to be unaffordable for too long?
I think in some cases, the IEA has been claimed to be too pessimistic on a lot of its historical ability to project and forecast costs in this. And I think no matter what, we're always surprised with how quickly innovation can actually turn around and drive down costs. What we've just seen, though, in the last few years with geothermal, and if you look at, for example, the annual technology baseline and the costs that have been reported, the costs have been continuously coming down. And so whether we're looking at data from Utah Forge or data that's being reported by the companies that are currently out there drilling and fracking, completing and starting to produce these wells, they're really pointing towards a downward slope on cost. And so I think we need to watch those really carefully, encourage companies to continue to talk about what innovations and then to talk about their successes, but also, which is a little more uncomfortable, to talk about their failures, because that's one of the areas that that we don't always learn as much about. And so having an opportunity to share information, whether it's technology collaboration platforms at the IEA, whether it's through public-private partnerships that are supported by governments and others, having an ability to understand what's working and what's not working will really speed through that cycle to help drive down those costs.
And maybe the reason to be optimistic is to look at other technologies and their trajectory. Mm-hmm. I think we have seen an incredible and in some cases very surprising results from other technologies. So 15 years ago, when I started working on renewables, the cost of producing electricity from solar PV was around $400 per megawatt hour. At the time, the cost of energy in the spot or wholesale electricity market was around 50. So we are talking about 9 times or 8 to 9 times more than they. And at the time, nobody thought that solar PV cost will be going down to today $30 per megawatt hour or $20 per megawatt hour. In some cases, everybody is really surprised. People were arguing that chemicals will not allow that. You cannot have this amount of polysilicon. All these things that we are discussing today around geothermal, everybody questioned that you cannot do this because of that efficiency levels. But industry has shown that these are all myths. So innovation can achieve a lot of the things, and then in this case, China mostly put their weight on solar PV, and other European and American companies for wind, that we saw an incredible cost reduction. So the question I think for us to say is like, why not? That's the reason for optimism for geothermal, and I think. And I agree with Rebecca on this, that even the first 2 projects and what they achieved in a short period of time is very important to watch. And I think there is a long trajectory, but we are optimistic, I'll say.
Mm-hmm. I think if you even, can I jump in there maybe just briefly as well? When I started working in the oil and gas industry, several decades ago, it was at the time when we were still looking at importing LNG into the U.S. And that shifted so quickly. And with Cheniere is a really interesting example how they turned around their import to their export and essentially started the LNG revolution. There's so much that can change so quickly in this space. And so I think really listening to those energy entrepreneurs around what it is that they see is happening and what it is that they need in order to grow to the next steps is really quite important.
I believe the IEA's made a prediction that we're going to need $1 trillion worth of investment by 2035. So perhaps you could both end with giving me one reason that you think that's going to be easy, because on the one hand, that feels like a colossal figure, but on the other hand, there are reasons for feeling positive that people will get there.
I mean, attracting $1 trillion investment cumulatively in the next decade, it may sound very big, but if you think about the overall energy investments in a decade, it's not a small part, but we are talking about trillions of dollars that will be invested in energy everywhere in the world, and I think investment it's 1 trillion number is important, but there is already a lot of movement that is in there, seeds of it, and I think if the governments are actually taking geothermal into their agenda, this can happen very quickly. I think that's the whole thing. We did this analysis a few years ago on hydropower, which is like an old technology. Not a lot of innovation is going on, but still we need that technology. And then the first suggestion that we gave to the governments that take hydropower into your energy planning agenda. That sounds very simple, but I think doing this for geothermal is quite important signal by the governments to the industry that, okay, we can invest in this industry because it is happening and governments has goals and targets to be able to do that. And I think if we can make believe geothermal and industry that this is a useful energy source that we will need, that will meet multiple challenges that we have, yet decarbonizing heat, producing dispatchable electricity flexibly, and so on and so forth, I think there is an optimism that this investment will flow.
Yeah, and I think Jaime said it really well. I think you started, Dan, saying that it's easy, and or maybe if it's easy, and I don't think it's going to be easy, but I think setting direction and giving it a policy goal, as Jaime laid out, is one of the most important things to do, especially as we look ahead towards achieving energy affordability, energy security. It really needs to be through a diverse portfolio of energy technologies. And geothermal in recent years has shown such promise, really to be able to satisfy all of those things. And so how do we support that and support the companies that are looking to move forward in that space?
That's great. Well, Jaime Bahar, Rebecca Schultz, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.